Welcome to my video. This is Ecojin. I'll be going over the mechanics of Grand Celestial Emperor, the final boss in Nightfall Sanctuary, also known as TT. Now keep in mind what we did here worked for our raid. It may not necessarily work for your group, but you'll at least have the general guideline on how to do this boss. The tank needs to be at 6 o'clock, everyone else at 12 o'clock, 3 meters from the boss. At any time throughout the fight, each time someone is hit by any of the boss attacks, it will fill the gauge. If the gauge is full, it wipes. The boss has 2 attributes that need to be managed for the duration of the fight. Sun is the yellow gauge that fills up the right half of the bar, and Moon is the purple gauge that fills up the left half of the bar, and that only fills up when people are hit. I'll explain in detail how that works further in the video. Now before we talk about attack rotation, we'll go through this Flamewave Circle phase. So when this message pops up, the Grand Celestial Emperor creates the Flamewave Circle. The 2 people closest to him will receive a debuff called Fallen and Blinding. The debuff lasts for 1 minute and 30 seconds. There are 3 circles in the room at 6, 10, and 2. During this phase, 2 out of 3 will light up, and it's RNG as to what combination will light up. The combo will dictate where Fallen and Blinding needs to go. So here's a little sheet here I created to help guide this. So if circles 10 and 2 are active, 10 is Blinding, 2 is Fallen. If 10 and 6 are active, 10 is Fallen, 6 is Blinding. If 2 and 6 are active, 2 is Fallen, 6 is Blinding. So a simple rule to remember is that if 6 o'clock circle is active, it's always Blinding, but this only applies for 90% and 30%. So in the case of the video, the circles are at 10 and 2 o'clock, which means Blinding must go to 10 and Fallen goes to 2. For the first Flamewave Circle, Blinding goes in alone at 10 o'clock. And then before the Fallen goes in at 2 o'clock, 2 people will go in first, and then Fallen goes in. It's best to SS as the edges of the circle will damage you if you touch it. Now we'll talk about the attack pattern. The first attack is going to be a triple swipe. It's blockable but causes knockbacks. The second attack is a little harder to see, but he's going to root the tank for 10 seconds with an explosive AoE on the tank. It will kill the tank if the tank is not within melee range of the boss, and it kills anyone else who is too close to the tank. That's why the tank is at 6 o'clock and we're at 12 o'clock, 3 meters from the boss. The boss will then summon a Golem that's going to randomly punch 5 times. You want people to stay close so that just not one person is taking all the punches. If you get punched 3 times, you will die. Moon block is ideal here, or Warlock Sanctum. He'll do a cross pattern attack with 8 lines, happens twice, it's unblockable. You can use FM or Destroyer Sheath, or you can do a self iframe. Better to self iframe for this. Next attack is a slow frontal swipe, where his hand can be on the left or right side. It's unblockable. And here's the second phase for Flamewave Circle. And here's the boss's last attack. He does a 180-degree AoE suction in the direction of the tank, followed by an unlinear blockable blast. Now for the second Flamewave Circle, it's at 10 and 2 o'clock again. So the person who had fallen debuff from the first Flamewave Circle phase will go into 10 o'clock first, and then the current blinding debuff person goes in. At the 2 o'clock circle, another 2 people without the debuffs go in first, and then the current fallen debuff person goes in. So you can see there, the person who had the fallen debuff from the first phase goes into 10 o'clock, and then I, since I have the current blinding debuff, will then go in. And then over there at 2 o'clock, 2 people without a buff went in, and then the current person with the fallen debuff goes in. Because we did it correctly, the Purifying Storm enables the Grand Celestial Emperor to absorb the fallen souls, appears, and that reduces 1.5 bars from the gauge. So here's the general method for reducing the gauge. During the Sun Stance, fallen debuff goes in first, and then the blinding carrier goes in. In Moon Stance, blinding debuff goes in first, and then fallen carrier goes in. So the first phase will begin at 90%. The boss will jump. And you'll see here, it says the Grand Celestial Emperor looks for a target to mark with Stigma. Each person in pairing will have a designated clock position based on their debuffs or lack of. So the boss will mark the one closest and one furthest. And you can visually confirm that with the weird circular symbol above their heads. The closest person will have the moon stigma, and the furthest will have the sun stigma. So the placement and where people go matters, as it will affect the type of circle. For 90% stigma phase, you need 1 circle, 1 light circle, and 5 shadow circles. So I'll show you on the sheet here. So this is essentially what you need to create with the buff combination. So to create light or shadow circles, you need 3 people together with a specific combination of blinding, fallen, or a lack of to create such circles. So here's the combination here. So recall that fallen and blinding, that happens during the Flamewave Circle phase. So when you pair a fallen, and neutral, that creates a shadow circle. If you pair a fallen, blinding, that creates shadow. If you pair fallen and 2 neutrals, that creates a shadow. And then another possible 3 combos is 2 blinding and a neutral, that creates a light circle. 2 blinding fallen creates light. 1 blinding, 2 neutral, that creates light. Now if you have 1 fallen, 1 blinding, 1 neutral, that creates death. You don't want that. So you have to keep that in mind, and that's how you will be able to pretty much, place people based on their roles during those Flamewave Circle phases. So for our group, we have 2 people at 2 o'clock at 12 meters, 1 person at 4 o'clock at 12 meters, 2 people at 6 meters, 2 people at 8 o'clock at 12 meters, and 1 person at 10 o'clock at 12 meters. The sun stigma starts at 6 o'clock, and the moon stigma will be at 12 o'clock. The boss will conduct sun stigma first, and then moon stigma, and then alternate back and forth in that order for a total of 6 conductions. So there's the first conduction to sun, and now he throws it at moon. Both stigmas will move clockwise to each pairing for conduction. So I moved to 4 o'clock to help with conduction, and the other person that was at 6 o'clock with me, not the stigma person, goes to 10 o'clock to help with that conduction. Only we can help with more than 1 conduction because we were the light circle. And the rest of the circles will be shadow. So if you were in a shadow circle and you flip another shadow circle, you will die. Basically, only the pairs at 6 o'clock can help conduct twice, and the stigmas can conduct as many as they want. Because at 6 o'clock, that's where I was, and I got light circle. Whereas the rest of these circles are shadow, so that's why I'm able to conduct more than once. The boss will do a fast room-wide stun AoE. So after conduction, you will have 1 light circle and 5 shadow circles. So they should look like as you see here in the video, and then also on the sheet here. So this is how your circles should look like. So this was the original, or this was the light circle here at 6. The rest of these are shadows. So that's what you want for 90%. The message, the Grand Celestial Emperor absorbs the power of the flame wave appears. So this is where you want to use Moon block. And he's also going to take mech damage that deals 15% damage to the boss's health if this phase was done correctly. The boss is going to transfer the trace of flame wave to the furthest person. Whoever is doing this is the buff carrier role, and they should already be far away and nearby the light circle. So you can see over there that Lin Gunner with the heart above their head. So they are the buff carrier. And this is also when you time the FM Destroyer sheath. So we got the sheath. So the farthest has been marked, and that allows them to absorb the light circle, giving them a 5 stack buff. So they are essentially the buff carrier. The Grand Celestial Emperor starts to amplify the power of the flame wave. So his CC bar is opened up. This is where you want to use knockdowns. Then Summoner or Assassin needs to shroud the get up animation, as it will cause knockbacks. So you want to assign 5 people to touch the buff carrier. Each time a person touches the buff carrier, it removes and transfers 1 stack from the carrier to the person who passed through them. All 5 stacks must be transferred from the buff carrier, otherwise they will die, and that will cause the boss to enrage. Now ideally there should be an order assigned from 1 to 5, so everyone gets their buffs 1 at a time. Having too many people pass through the buff carrier at once can cause someone to miss their buff. Okay, so as the boss is KD'd, the tank needs to kite the boss to the 2 o'clock shadow circle, and at the same time the 5 people who grab the buffs from the buff carrier needs to go to their assigned circles to convert the shadow circles to light before the boss is kited onto them, with priority to convert 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock circles first. So we'll go back to the sheet real quick here. So the boss was right around here in between the 5 shadow circle here and the 6 o'clock light. So he was knocked down. Tank kites it to the first shadow circle here at 2 o'clock, which would be converted to light before it lands on there. And then the next order will be number 2, and then it goes to 3, 4, and then 5. So as the boss lands, it creates a damage shockwave followed by a knockback AoE. So if you get hit by these, it will convert some of that damage and add it to the gauge to the bar. So when the boss recovers from the knockdown, so do the knockdown here, he'll cast some simple damage AoEs that contribute to the bar if you do not iframe. So it's important to communicate when people should simply take the damage to reduce the bar. It should be communicated when people should take damage, that way it fills the bar, or they should iframe when there's too much of the bar, because you want to have about maybe a bar and a half, a bar full at most. You don't want any less than 1 bar. So it was KD'd. The tank is then going to go to the next circle. Next circle is 4 o'clock. Remember, that animation right there will cause knockbacks if you do not iframe that. CC bar opens up. You want a KD. The goal is to keep the gauge around 1 bar. Remember, getting hit by the boss adds to the bar, and during this phase, each time the boss eats a circle, it reduces nearly 1 bar. And you do not want the bar to be empty, nor over 2 bars full. And if you're in the circles after the boss gets knocked down, and he, leaves the circle, that will give you a skill reset. So next circle will be 8 o'clock. So he jumps. CC bar opens up, knock down. Get up animation, take the damage. That way it adds to the bar. Jumps. CC to knock down. Gets up. So you can see we did not iframe because we took the hits. That adds to the bar. Last circle is at 12 o'clock, which was the original starting position of the initial boss fight. And it's important throughout the phase to play with the bar and keep it within 1 to 2 bars filled, no more, no less. The Grand Celestial Emperor absorbed blinding power from the Flamewave region, so this will appear. This is where you want to use FM or Destroyer Sheath for the room-wide multi-AoE. So this will end the phase. The boss goes back to its regular attack pattern. So remember, the regular attack pattern is triple swipe. Roots the tank for 10 seconds. Summons golems. Cross pattern. Slow frontal swipe. and then the 180-degree AoE suction in the direction of the tank, followed by a unblockable linear blast. For 60%, you want to fill the gauge to about 1.5 bars, so you will have to have some people take some hits from his attack to fill up the bars. Alright, so Flamewave Circle for 60% operates similar to 90%, but the blinding and fallen circles, the combo patterns, they're reversed. So I'll show you back here. So remember this. So this applies for 90 and 30%. For 60%, just have it flipped. That's basically how it works. So 2 people will go close to get fallen and blinding. Flamewave circles are at 2 and 6 o'clock. So 2 unbuffed people will go into the blinding circle at 2 o'clock. So you can see there. And then the blinding debuff person goes in. Now, the same blinding debuff person now goes to 6 o'clock and stands in the fallen circle. The person with fallen debuff goes in. And then the message, the blinding power surge enables the Grand Celestial Emperor to absorb the power of the blinding power. That'll appear as a text confirmation that you have reduced the gauge. You can also look at it visually as well. You can see the gauge was about 2 bars filled. Now it's just barely a half a bar. So remember, the mechanic reduces about 1.5 bars. So you want to have around 2 bars filled so that it does not go under the gauge, because that will be a problem if it does. Alright, so 60%. Grand Celestial Emperor looks for a target to mark with Stigma. So similar to 90% Stigma phase, except the position and pairing will, as always, depend on the number of Flamewave circles you did and who has fallen and blinding debuffs. So for our positioning, we had 2 people at 2 o'clock at 12 meters, 2 people at 4 o'clock at 12 meters, 2 people at 6 o'clock at 12 meters, 2 at 8 o'clock at 12 meters, and 2 at 10 o'clock at 12 meters. And then remember that for Stigma, he'll mark the one closest with Moon Stigma and the one farthest with Sun Stigma. Sun Stigma is at 4 o'clock for the first conduction. And then the Moon Stigma goes to 6 o'clock for the alternating conduction. Sun Stigma will then move counterclockwise to conduct at 2 and 10 o'clock, and then Moon Stigma then goes clockwise to conduct with 8 o'clock. Now during these Stigma phases, once you're freed as the DPS, it's safe to DPS the boss around 3 or 4 o'clock, because you don't want to accidentally conduct with any other groups. Alright, so I go to 12 o'clock at 6 meters from the boss. Both Stigmas group up with me to conduct. And as I said before, people need to be mindful of where they're standing to avoid being part of conduction when they're DPSing. Same rule still applies to who can conduct more than once. So once that's done, you should have 5 light circles and 1 shadow circle. So I'll show you that on the sheet here. So here's 60%. So you can see the pattern looks exactly the same as 90% and 30%, except it's the opposite. You have 5 light, 1 shadow. Alright, so the Grand Celestial Emperor absorbs the power of Flamewave, Hongmoon block, transfers trace of the Flamewave. So he's going to mark the furthest for buff carrier, and this is also where you want to use FM sheath or destroyer sheath. The buff carrier absorbs the shadow circle. CC bar will open up. He amplifies the power of the flame wave, so this is where you want to use knockdown. Remember, after knockdown, he does do a get up animation that causes knockback, so you want to use Assassin or Summoner Shroud for that initial get up. 5 people will pass through the buff carrier to get their buff. They will then touch their assigned light circle to convert it. The tank then goes to the 2 o'clock circle to bait the boss. Boss jumps to 2 o'clock. So remember, that animation right there is the knockback. CC bar opens up, knock down. He jumps to the next, so tank is then at the 4 o'clock. Same thing, repeat. So knock down. Remember, you want to play with the bars. You want to keep it around 1 to 2 bars, not too much. So that's 8 o'clock circle. Next is 10. And then see how the tank goes over to the 12 o'clock circle for the last circle positioning. So you can see there we ended the phase, and we have about almost half of a bar filled. So this is how you need to play with the bar. So the Grand Celestial Emperor absorbed Rock Salt from the Flamewave region, so FM Destroyer Sheath. And now we're back to the regular rotation. So remember, for the golems, you can use Hongmoon block or Warlock Sanctum. Remember that any of his attacks here, if you get hit by them, it will add to the gauge. And that's how you avoid the suction and the AoE blast. Alright, so here's the first phase of Flamewave Circle. Remember, he picks 2 closes, gives Fallen to one, blinding to the other. So in this case, it's 10 and 2 o'clock again. So 2 is blinding, and 10 is Fallen. Remember that 2 people go in first, and then Fallen goes in. And blinding can go in solo for the first Flamewave Circle phase. So we're holding DPS just a little bit, so we can fit in a second Flamewave Circle phase. So there it is, marks 2 of the closest, gives Fallen and blinding. So it's at 10 and 6. So for Fallen, 2 go in, unbuffed first, and then Fallen goes in. And then the person who had the Fallen debuff from the previous phase goes in first, and then the current blinding then goes in at 6 o'clock. That is now complete. So you see this prompt here, the Purifying Storm enables the Grand Celestial Emperor to absorb the fallen souls. Alright, so back to Stigma. So since we did 2 Flamewave Circles for 90% and we did 2 for 30%, the positioning and the pairing will exactly be the same, since we're using we're using the same people for the Flamewave phases. So remember that he marks the closest and furthest with Stigma. And this will be a mirror of what we did in 90%. So 90% and 30% will be the same, provided you did the same amount of Flamewave Circles. And because we did, it's exactly going to be the same for us. So we did that because it just simplifies things. And then I go to 4 o'clock to help with that conduction, because we only had 1 there with the Stigma. So we have 1 light circle, 5 shadows, Half Moon block, he puts the buff on the furthest person, FM sheath. The buff carrier goes into the light circle. They have the buff. 5 people pass through them to get the buff to convert the shadow circles into light. Once again, tank kites the boss to the 2 o'clock circle first. Boss jumps. Knock down. Tank goes through then 4 o'clock shadow, or 4 o'clock light circle. And then tank is now going to 8 o'clock. So remember, all these CCs are knockdowns. So you don't want to have the bar too high. If it's too high, you want people to iframe. If it's too low, you want people to take the damage. So back to 12 o'clock at the original position. FM sheath or destroyer sheath. And there we go. So for after this phase, after 30%, if you do end up having to do Flamewave Circle because you do not have enough DPS, treat it like 60% Flamewave phase. So you might have noticed the term 211 be tossed around. So those numbers are associated with the Flamewave Circles you do in 90, 60, and 30%. In this video, we did 2 Flamewave Circles at 90, 1 at 60, and 2 at 30, hence 211. It's possible to do 111 if you have lots of DPS. That, of course, will then change the Stigma phase of the pairings of where people go. So the number of Flamewave Circles, like I said before, that will depend on the raid DPS, as more DPS means less Flamewave Circles needed, but keep in mind the total number of Fallen and Blinding debuffs after Flamewave Circle phase will dictate where people must go for Stigma phase. So there we go, that is the mechanics for the Grand Celestial Emperor in TT. I will include a detailed summary of the mechanics in the video description. As always, you'll find my social links there as well. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please ask. I will do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching. Hope that helps.